The United States is about to cancel the dollar and make your savings absolutely worthless. This is a very bold claim. Even when I came across it, I couldn't believe my eyes. The US dollar is the most stable currency that has ever existed in the history of humanity. But what the US government is about to do will fundamentally change the course of the US history and will reshape the entire global financial system. The US government is purposely trying to devalue the dollar, and that will create massive inflation. The kind of inflation that you have never seen in your entire lifetime. That will directly impact you, it will impact your savings, it will impact your wages and your entire financial future. So here in this video, I'm going to break down what exactly the government said and what they plan to do. I'm not going to share my opinion, but rather I will simply give you the facts and the data and you will judge by yourself. If you're ready, give this video a thumbs up and let's get right into it. The biggest problem that the US government is facing right now is that it is headed into a real bankruptcy. And I know that you have heard that a lot, but that problem has been accumulating over the last couple of decades and now it got out of control. And the problem consists of two fundamental parts. The first part is that there has always been a huge trade deficit in the US budget for over like 50 or 60 years. But that deficit has grown dramatically and right now it's around $1 trillion. So it's not some kind of a conspiracy or an opinion. You can literally mathematically predict when the US government is going to go out of business, when it's going to run out of money. Imagine you're making $100,000, but you're spending $120,000. Where are you getting that extra $20,000? Probably a credit card, and there is an interest on the top of that extra debt that you're spending. In the first year, it's not a big deal. But over time, that gap is going to grow and that interest is going to grow, and one day you won't be able to pay that. And that's exactly the situation that the US government is right now. So it's trying to take measures in order to fix the problem. And the solution they are presenting to us is something that will have a fundamental impact on the entire global economy, especially on your savings and your wages. The second problem that the United States has is the national debt, which stands at around $36 trillion. Last time I made a video about something like that, the debt was like $36 trillion. And now an additional $200 billion were added in the last couple of months. So the debt keeps growing and the government knows that there is no way that the government will be able to pay off this debt. We know for a fact that the government does not plan to pay the debt. But if the government does not pay the debt, it will damage the reputation of the United States and no one will want to do business with the US. So the US came with a very genius solution that I'm gonna show it to you. This is not my opinion. What I will show to you might sound extreme and outrageous and unbelievable, but this is exactly what they're proposing. The proposal is as big as the proposal back in 1971 when they untied the dollar from the gold. If you go back, let's say to 1960, 65, 68, or even to 1970, nobody could have even possibly imagined that the President of the United States will come out and will say that we're untying the dollar from the gold. That was something unimaginable. And this solution is as unimaginable as Nixon taking out the dollar out of the gold standard. The plan is very simple. We want to devalue the dollar further, even though that it has been devaluing over the last 50, 60, or probably since its inception when we actually created the Fed. But the devaluation that the Fed wants to do right now is way bigger than we have seen in the entire history of the dollar. And the goal behind it is that, first of all, we want to boost the US exports. One of the fundamental reasons why America is running such a huge trade deficit is because the dollar is very strong compared to other countries. Let me give you an example of how devaluing the dollar is going to boost the exports of the United States. Let's just say hypothetically that this pen is being manufactured in China and $1 is equals 5 Chinese yuans. And that means that if this pen is being manufactured in China for 5 Chinese yuan and is being now shipped to the United States, we're going to convert 5 Chinese yuan to dollars, which is $1, and it can be sold for $1 in the United States. Again, this is just a hypothetical example where we did not include taxes, tariffs, and other factors that come in. Now, let's say, for example, that China is going to devalue its currency, which means that instead of $1 being equal to 5 Chinese yuan, now $1 is going to equal to 10 Chinese yuan. That means that the Chinese yuan got weaker and the dollar got stronger, because with $1 now you can buy more Chinese yuan. That's what it means when you weaken and strengthen the dollar. Now, let's go back to our example of a pen. What does happens to the price of this pen? It still costs 5 Chinese yuan to manufacturers in China. And now if I'm going to bring this pen back to the United States and I'm getting it for 5 Chinese yuan, what is going to be the price in the United States? It is going to be 50 cents, because $1 now equals to 10 Chinese yuan, and this costs 5 yuans, and 5 yuans is 50 cents. Suddenly, the price of the Chinese pen in the United States is going to be much cheaper, which is going to make them much more competitive. And that is the logic of international trade. Over the last 50, 60, or probably even 70 years, the United States was running such a huge, strong dollar. And that strong dollar made the US exports much more less competitive compared to the rest of the world. And that's why the United States was consuming so much resources, and those resources were paid by the debt, because the rest of the world accepted the fact that we don't actually need anything from the United States other than the dollar. The dollar was so powerful that the rest of the world simply accepted a piece of paper from the United States as a form of payment instead of paying the rest of the countries with goods and services, just like those countries that are bringing stuff to the United States. Do you actually see the logic? And now the United States is in so much debt that it understands that mathematically it's on the way to become bankrupt, and it won't be able to afford the lifestyle that it had over the last 50, 60, and 70 years. So we have to do something, and we have to devalue the dollar in order to make the dollar cheaper compared to other countries. And that means that when you bring things from the rest of the world, from China, those things are going to be more expensive. And that is the logic. So let's go back to the same example of the pencil that I gave you. If, for example, $1 was equal to 5 Chinese yuan, and we are going to make the dollar much weaker, which means that $1 is going to equal to 2.5 Chinese yuan. Again, this is an example. And we still manufacture this pen for 5 Chinese yuan. Now, if we bring it to the United States for 5 Chinese yuan, 5 Chinese yuan is going to equal to $2. Now, suddenly the price of the pen jumped by 100%. So devaluing the dollar makes your money less valuable. Devaluing the dollar makes your savings less valuable. And that makes more imports much more expensive. So that BMW that comes from Germany, those cars that come from Canada, those cars that come from Mexico, all the electronics that comes from China, all of that is suddenly going to be much more expensive in the United States than they were in the past. On the other hand, if you're building stuff in the United States, the demand for them around the world will be much higher. So Ford cars will be more competitive compared to German cars. The second reason behind devaluation of the dollar is it's gonna be cheaper to pay the debt. If we go back, for example, 50 years ago when the dollar was much stronger, we borrowed a certain amount of money. And now 50 years later, the dollar became weaker, but that debt still the same at that price. Now, paying that debt is much cheaper than it is right now. If you have borrowed, for example, from your uncle 20 years ago, $100,000, and you have to pay him today, you have to pay him less money, even though that you still have to pay him technically the exact same $100,000. That is the exact amount. That is on paper. But the real value of that $100,000 have diminished because of inflation, which means that realistically, it's much easier for you to pay $100,000 today than it was 20 years ago. But if we create massive inflation and massively devalue the dollar, so those $36 trillion worth of debt that the government has right now are not going to be as painful as they were back in the days. Yes, today that looks like a real big amount, $36 trillion. But if we massively print a lot of money, create massive inflation, then those $36 trillion don't actually worth as much. If you go back to 2005 and 2006, back in Zimbabwe, there was hyperinflation and they had like notes of trillions of dollars. So if you owed somebody $1 trillion and the next morning the government issued the $10 trillion note because of hyperinflation, you can easily pay that debt. Now, this is an extreme example, of course, but that is the logic behind it. They call them Mar-a-Lago Accords, similar to the Plaza Accords back during the Reagan days. The United States had a very similar problem back in 1980s, and President Reagan took very similar action and they devalued the dollar that made the US exports much more competitive. Now, that led to a lot of global financial crises in countries that accepted the US measures. Japan's financial bubble burst and it took the country into a financial crisis that still lasts until today. And the Japanese GDP hasn't grown since 1996. So the first proposal they have is that I'm going to literally quote it so that you know what exactly is happening. And I'm not literally coming out with this. This is exactly what they're saying. A Mar-a-Lago Accord where countries' central bank reserve managers agreed to swap their holdings of short-term treasury securities for century bonds, means 100-year bonds. If countries don't agree to this, they would subject to tariffs and they have US security guarantees removed. The United States right now issues different kind of government bonds or treasury bills. 3-month treasury bills, 2 years treasury bills, 1 year treasury bill, 6-month treasury bill. And a treasury bill or a bond is a form of debt. The government is issuing a 3-month treasury bill. You buy that treasury bill and you pay the government a sum of money as a form of debt. And the government is paying you interest. 3 months from now, the government has to pay you back that money that it has actually borrowed. But because the government has so much debt, it realistically cannot possibly raise so much money from taxes to pay all of these debts. So the government over the last 50, 60 years, or probably longer than that, came with a very genius solution to fix that problem. Because the government cannot right now pay this debt, the government is going to issue new debt to a new investor, and it will sell a new debt to a new investor and then take that money and pay the older debt. It's very close to a pyramid scheme where the government issues new debts in order to pay off its older debts. Imagine you have a lot of money borrowed from one bank and there is a deadline that you have to pay that debt, but you don't have the money. You are going to go to a second bank, borrow money from the second bank and pay the first bank. Now, you still owe money to the second bank right now, even though that you paid the first bank. Now, you run out of time and then you have to pay the second bank. Now, you don't have the money to do that. Your income, your salary does not allow you to do that. So you go to a third bank and borrow money from the third bank to pay the second bank, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly what the government is doing every single time when it's time to pay off its debts. And that's why the debt keeps growing, because every time there is an extra interest that is being charged. And the government is simply doing the absolute best in order to pay the minimum interest payment instead of actually paying off the debt. Because each time, instead of paying off the debt, it's borrowing new debt to pay off older debts. But from the other side, it's actually great news, because the government can actually borrow debt later at a lower interest rate when we have lower interest rates. Suppose, for example, the government lends money at 5% interest rate. That is the bond that has a 5% interest rate. Fast forward to 2021, when interest rates were at around 0%, the government could now borrow money at 3% interest rate. Again, this is a hypothetical example. So it can literally create new debt to a new investor and pay off the previous investor. The previous debt had a 5% interest rate and the new debt has a 3% interest rate. Now, the interest payments right now are going to be much lower than they were in the past. On the other side, if interest rates grow, then those people who actually hold those bonds, they will sell their old bonds and buy the new bonds, because the new bonds have a much higher interest rate. So it depends on the interest rate. It's either the people who are loaning that money win, or the people who are borrowing that money. When the interest rates are very low, the borrowers enjoy low interest rates. When the interest rates are high, the lenders enjoy high interest rates, because they can collect higher rates on their loans. There are several countries that hold large amount of US government bonds. So Japan holds something over $1.2 trillion. China holds also something around $800 billion. The UK, Luxembourg, Canada, and pretty much every single country around the world holds a lot of US government bonds. And the United States is proposing to them, listen, you're going to take all of your government bonds that you have in your bank accounts, that you have in your central banks, and you will swap them for 100-year bonds. Now you're going to take that 3-month treasury bills and you will exchange it for 100-year treasury bill. And that means that we don't have to pay you in 3 months, but we have to pay you in 100 years from now. And the United States wants to do that with all of these treasury bills. This is really great news for the US government because the government no longer has to worry about constantly raising money in the short run to pay off its 3-month treasury bills or 2-year treasury bills or 1-year treasury bills or even 10-year treasury bills, and simply can know that this is the amount of interest that we have to pay because the US government wants to lock in the interest rates for these 100-year treasury bills. So let's say, for example, that the interest rates are like 4%. That's it. You have your debts and the government will pay you 4% interest rate for the next 100 years, and you're not allowed to sell that 10-year treasury bill, or not to sell that treasury. You can actually sell it in the open market, but that is a 100-year treasury bill. The principal that the government has to pay you is going to be in 100 years from now. But why would the government do something like that? What if the interest rates drop in the foreseeable future? The government simply can refinance its loan and simply pay a much lower interest rate. On the other side, if interest rates increase, it won't allow those people to refinance their debts or simply sell their debts and buy new government bonds at a higher interest rate. And that is the point, because the US government understands that if we actually print so much money, it is going to cause massive inflation, which means that we will not be able to lower interest rate in the foreseeable future, and we will have to increase massively interest rates. And that means that we have to issue new government bonds at a higher interest rate. And all those people who are holding trillions of dollars of our government bonds, they will dump their government bonds and they will buy government bonds at a higher interest rate, let's say 10% or maybe 20%. So in order to avoid doing that, we're going to force them to lock their money for 100 years. They can take those government bonds and they can sell them to whoever you want. But are you going to buy a government bond that pays you 4% interest rate when interest rates right now are 20%, just hypothetical? Of course not, because the new government bonds that will be issued where the interest rates are high will actually have a 20% interest rate because they have to be as high as the general interest rate. Now, the next question is that, but what if the interest rates drop to 0%, just like in 2020? Wouldn't the government actually benefit that there is always an option to refinance a debt? Well, that is absolutely true. That makes sense. But what if the government does not expect for the interest rates to drop in the foreseeable future? The government would know that, right? Because if the government massively prints a lot more money in order to cause massive inflation and devalue the dollar, it knows that sooner or later it will have to dramatically increase interest rates. And that means that those government bond payments will be much higher. So if we can actually take all of the debt that we have right now, the $36 trillion, and force the people or the investors to lock them for 100 years at 3 or 4% interest rate, then we can massively print money, make the value of these dollars much less valuable, which means that the value of these bonds or debt will be much less valuable. We can simply print money to pay the interest on the debt that we have right now. And if that is going to cause massive inflation, we can increase the interest rates by the Fed. And those people won't be able to actually dump their government bonds because the principal will be paid 100 years from now, which will keep the situation stable, which will keep the market or the US debt stable. It doesn't sound fair. Why would those countries or those people who are actually borrowing or having or holding so much US government bonds will agree to something like that? It's not in their favor. Maybe tomorrow the situation is going to change and they would actually want to refinance. Maximum they can lock their money is probably 10 years, and that's why we have 10-year government bonds. And that's why the US said that we're going to pressure them with a lot of tariffs to force them to agree to something like that. This is literally what they said. Let me just read that again. If countries don't agree to this, they would be subject to tariffs and have US security guarantees removed. Countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, those countries that rely on the United States for security guarantees, especially the NATO countries, if they don't agree to this deal that you're making that is clearly not favorable to them, you're simply not going to protect them. And they will have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on their own militaries and protection, which is why this is the measure that we're going to use in order to force them to do so. And now you start to understand why the United States right now, or Trump in particular, is imposing and playing the tariff war. He's trying to play the trade war, raise tariffs on everybody, and force them to agree to the deal that he's trying to make. Lock all of these countries for 100-year government bonds. The second part of the plan is that the US could charge a user fee on reserve assets held by other countries. For example, a fee of 1% of coupons, which might increase to 2% if the USD devaluation is insufficient. And this is probably the most outrageous things that I probably ever came across. The point they're trying to make is that we're going to charge you a fee for holding our debt. So the US government lend them money and the US has to pay them an interest. For example, China holds $800 billion of US debt. So the United States has to pay China an interest. Let's say that interest is 2%, 3%, 5%, depends on that bond rate. Now the government, the US government is saying, listen, we're going to charge you a fee for holding our debt. We're simply going to charge you a fee because you loaned us that money. That sounds so insane that I cannot possibly believe that I'm reading that. We're not going to call it an interest, we're going to call it a fee. And we are going to do that because you're loaning us too much money. The reason why so many countries left with so much US debt is because as those countries started selling massively to the US consumers because their products were much more price competitive and people in the United States started buying their products, they took that money and invested that money in the US government bonds. So why would you actually bring those dollars from the United States to China or to Japan or to the UK? You can simply take that money and buy US government bonds, and now the government of the United States will pay you interest and now owes you money. And now the United States is playing a completely different game. It's like, oh, you lent us so much money, now you have to pay us an interest because now you have to pay us a fee because we allow you to lend us money. I know that all of this sounds incredibly insane, but this is the Mar-a-Lago Accords. And the logic behind it is that we are going to use this fee as a tool in order to discourage people to pay US government bonds. So if you actually make money, please don't buy US government bonds. Please do not loan money to the US government. So if 1% is not enough, we're going to increase it to 2%. So this is a form of manipulation. This is a form of punishing countries. So if China, for example, massively selling stuff in the United States, we're going to charge them a 2 or 3% interest rate, or a fee. So if the interest rate on that bond is 3% and we charge them a 3% fee, and that means that they loan us $800 billion and now we have to pay them 3% interest rate on that $300 billion. But because we charge them a 3% fee, we don't have to pay them anymore, which means that we got that debt for absolutely free. I know that it sounds insane. When I was reading this, I couldn't actually believe it, but this is the point. The main question is that why is the government doing something insane? And I believe the only reason that this is possible, or the only reason that the government would do something like that, is because the government is planning to massively devalue the dollar, and that's exactly what the administration said straightforward. We want to devalue the dollar because it's very strong, and this is the plan to devalue the dollar. Devaluing devaluing the dollar means that your dollars will become less valuable. And that also means that the assets are going to dramatically rise. So if you're sitting on millions of dollars of cash, suddenly you'll find your cash much less valuable than they were in the past. So this might probably be the best time to actually learn how to preserve your wealth, know which assets to buy and which assets to avoid, because a lot of great good assets are going to rise dramatically in value. And if you want to become a professional investor and know exactly how do you take advantage out of it, then there is a link in the description of this video that will help you exactly how to do that. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.